I have the pleasure of introducing our guest, who will be speaking with us about his newest book, The Boys in the Bunkhouse, Servitude and Salvation in the Heartland. Dan Barry, who is here with us this evening, is an esteemed reporter and columnist for the New York Times and has been since 1995, focusing especially on his column, The Land, since 2007, which has taken him all around the country. However, his professional success did not begin at and is not limited to his time at the New York Times. While working for the Providence Journal-Bulletin prior to the New York Times, Mr. Barry was part of a team who won a Polk Award in 1992 for their work in examining a state banking crisis. He was also part of a team who won the 1994 Pulitzer Prize after investigating corruption in the court system in Rhode Island. Mr. Barry has since been a finalist for a Pulitzer Prize, not once, but twice.
Two-time loser.
The first time was in 2006 for his work covering post-Hurricane Katrina, and the second time in 2010 for his analysis of how the Great Recession affected lives in America. Additional awards include, but are not limited to, the American Society of Newspaper Editors Award in 2003, the 2005 Mike Berger Award, the 2010 Sigma Delta Chi Award, and the 2015 Best American Newspaper Narrative Award. In addition to writing The Boys in the Bunkhouse, Dan Barry has also authored 3 other books, including a popular favorite titled Bottom of the 33rd, Hope, Redemption, and Baseball's Longest Game. I was fortunate enough to meet Dan Barry this summer in Baltimore at an annual conference that my organization that I was interning for held, and I interned for the National Disability Rights Network. He was there signing copies of his book, The Boys in the Bunkhouse. During my short chat with Dan Barry, while he was signing a copy for me, I was shocked yet thrilled to learn that this highly respected author and New York Times reporter would be visiting middle of nowhere Minnesota in a pottery studio to discuss this very book I was purchasing about an issue that I became involved in, educated about, and ultimately passionate about throughout the course of my internship. Through his book, Dan Barry champions in illustrating the exploitation and abuse of a group of men with intellectual disability on a turkey processing plant in Iowa, and ultimately brought rising attention to society's understanding or misunderstanding of individuals with disabilities throughout the past and into the present. I could not be more delighted to have him here this evening, or more honored to welcome to St. John's University, Mr. Dan Barry.
Thank you, Mary. You notice anything?
You got a shiner there.
Yeah, I apologize. So I'm going to just sit this way so as not to be distracting.
Well, we all know this is a really special day. I'm sure you all know that it is. Of course, I'm referring to the fact that today is the 50th anniversary of Star Trek first being aired on NBC in 1966. So, no, I, of course, am referring to the fact that we have Dan Barry with us today. So let me just start out. 45.8 million. That's the number that's estimated, the number of people in slavery today throughout the world. And we in the United States think of it as a problem that we associate with ISIS or Boko Haram in Nigeria or with workers in the Middle East or in Asia. And this is all true. But slavery and servitude exist here in the United States today. And there's a piece of paper going around back there. I just today on one of my economics lists that I follow had an article about prison labor in the United States. How men and women, in order to get health care when they're incarcerated, have to work a certain number of hours to earn money so that they can go to the hospital or to get treated for an injury. So it's here. And Dan Barry tells the story of how a group of men lived in servitude for 35 years in Atalissa. I always want to say it right. It's Atalissa, Iowa. It is at times a horror story with brutal work, terrible working and living conditions, and unimaginable suffering. But it's also a story of hope, of good people making a difference. of men whose determination to take one day at a time, frankly, renewed my faith in humanity. And Dan, you tell the story with grace, humanity, and the voice of someone who truly cares. So let me add my welcome to St. John's
Thank you.
and St. Ben's.
Thanks very much.
What I'd like to do is we can start a conversation, see maybe half an hour or so, and then open it up. But we could open it up earlier. We'll just let things flow as they're gonna, whatever way
Okay.
they want to flow. So first, how did you come to write about these men who've come to be known as the boys in the bunkhouse?
As Mary said, I write a column called This Land. It's taken me all over the country to all 50 states. And I hadn't been to Iowa in a while. We've all had that feeling. And so I went, to Iowa virtually looking at stories on websites and what have you. And there's a very small article about a lawsuit related to this case. It was brought by the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, and they had prevailed, and it was a huge verdict of $240 million on behalf of the men, but of course that was knocked down to $2 or $3 million because of caps on jury awards, and ultimately the men didn't get anything for many years. So I saw that little article, really it was about 100 words, and this was big news in Iowa, but I don't know why, for some reason it didn't go over state lines in many ways. I don't know why. And so I saw it, I had known nothing about it, and there were phrases in the little article. 32 men with intellectual disability, living in an old schoolhouse, working at a meat processing plant for 35 years, earning $65 a month plus room and board for 35 years, and being financially and sometimes physically exploited. And I was flabbergasted on many levels. I hadn't heard about it, and everything that was in that 100-word piece blew my mind. So I called up the EEOC lawyer, and I said, I'd really like to write about this, but in order to do so, I need to talk to the men, because as I said to a class today, I believe in including people in their own narrative. I mean, I didn't want to be a reporter talking around these men as if they were separate from us. It seems to me they had already gone through enough of that. And I wanted to hear their story. And the lawyer said, no one has spoken to them. And I said, why not? And the lawyer said, no one has asked. And right off the bat, that was a tip-off, to me at least, about the separation between the so-called non-disabled and people with intellectual disability. Mm-hmm. And so, quite frankly, I still thought I would write, maybe a 1,200-word column. I would parachute in, do it in a few days and come back. But the more I got into it, the more I knew I was in for the long term.
Well, that anticipates my first or second question, or however you want to count it. You start the book with a preface, and it's focused on one of the men. And is it Willie Levy?
Levi.
Willie Levi. And then chapter 1 focuses on a call that a social worker gets. And one of these middle of the night calls, late night calls about something's going on. And you could have started the book with either one. So why did you choose to start with Willie Levi?
Right. I struggled with that. So the chapter 1 begins with a social worker getting a call saying there's a bunch of men living in squalor in an old schoolhouse in Atalissa. And it's a fairly dramatic moment if you construct it properly. But I wrote about 5,000 words with that as the beginning. And I felt that it had no heart. I felt that in that construction there was a gaping absence, and the absence was that of the men. Okay, so I set it all aside, and then I wrote a preface where it's really about 2,000 words, where you get to know one of the men who becomes representative of many of the men. Mm-hmm. Who are these guys? Where the hell did they come from? How did they wind up here? And to create them, to signal that each man is an individual, and that it's not a group of men. They're not all the same. Each man is an individual. So that's why. So there's a little introduction to Levi, and then we tell you the story.
So it's like what you were saying a moment ago, that nobody had asked to talk to them, and so you're putting them right up at the beginning of the story, giving them their voice.
Right, and it's their story. I'm kind of a conduit, but it's their story, and I wanted them front and center. You're right.
Okay. That struck me right off the bat. So can you tell us a little bit about I use character with a capital C for these guys, T.H. Johnson and Kenneth Henry. They're the guys who created this thing called, I use the word thing on purpose too, it's hard to know what it is, Henry's Turkey Service, that somehow contracted with the Lewis Rich plant there in Muscatine County, Iowa, for these men's labor.
Right.
Who are these guys? Where did they come from?
It's like
They're like characters out
Butch
of
Cassidy and the Sundance Kid,
Yeah.
right? Who are these guys? So you know, it's commercial interest at play here. So Lewis Rich has a meat processing plant, and as Ann over here can attest, the work that goes on in there is horrible. And so Lewis Rich had trouble finding employment to do the worst jobs in this difficult workplace, and that would be unloading the turkeys from the crates, they're alive, and then hanging them on shackles, and then after they've been killed, eviscerating them. It's just a horrible job, and Lewis Rich couldn't find people who would stay in this job. Meanwhile, down in Texas, the state schools of Texas, which are the institutions for people with intellectual disability, at least back then, were looking to unload, empty the beds. Again, economic interests. In part, it was to have people with intellectual disability integrated into the community where they rightfully belonged. But also, you know what? This is costing the state money. Let's get them out of here. Let's make them tax-paying citizens. So an arrangement was made between the state and this rancher in Goldthwaite, Texas, named T.H. Johnson, kind of a larger-than-life kind of guy. And to T.H. Johnson's credit, okay, as I said to you yesterday, there's a lot of gray area here. You know, it's not black and white. It wasn't like people got together and said, let's screw some people with intellectual disability. It's not really what happened. And so the state approached many ranchers and said, hey, would you take a few guys with intellectual disability and teach them a trade, and we'll clear out the beds and we'll figure out something. No one wanted to do it except T.H. Johnson. So to his credit, he said, I'll take a shot at it. So he took some of these guys, taught them how to catch turkeys. That's a whole nother skill. And then he and his partner, Kenneth Henry, began to contract them out to turkey processing plants in several states, including Iowa. So they would say to you, and T.H. Johnson died several years ago, and Kenneth Henry died just a couple of months ago. These were the two partners of Henry's Turkey Service. They did not see what they were doing as exploitation in any way. What they saw themselves as doing was taking men that no one else wanted, okay, bringing them in, creating a fraternity, putting them in the bunkhouse, teaching them skills, being there when they were down, giving them $5 to go down to the mini mart to get sardines or to get a Mountain Dew or some beef jerky, and taking them to the amusement park once in a while. Oh, and by the way, they were also working 5 days a week at the worst job imaginable and being underpaid. But they saw it as, look, no one else is doing anything. We were here for them. Where were you? You know, that's a legitimate question.
Well, and I can imagine, for example, if you were going to turn this into a melodrama, these would be the guys with the black hats. They would be the ones with the curly mustache.
Right.
And they're the villains of the piece. And I think you make it really clear through the book that this isn't, like you said, a situation where you decide, all right, we're going to do this. It's incremental, like so many things in life. You slide along,
Absolutely.
and all of a sudden you find yourself in this situation that you didn't think you'd be in 10 years ago,
That's
or
right.
even 5 years ago.
Right. And both men had their frailties, and T.H. Johnson in particular struggled with alcoholism. And so as he declined, so too did the conditions in the bunkhouse, and so too did the care that was granted to these men. Having said that, T.H. Johnson and Kenneth Henry also denied these men many, many basic human rights and basic civil rights. So that's on the other side of the equation.
Oh, that gets to what I wanted to ask next, which is...
I'm just leading you
yeah,
on.
yeah, you are. This is perfect. We coordinated all of them. We talked a little, we had a nice book group yesterday to talk about some of this, and one of the things that I mentioned and that one of the students picked up on was that the early days, say the mid-1970s to the late 1980s, early 1990s were, and I hate to even use this, but they were in quotes, good years. They were the times when things weren't so bad. Like clearly these men were denied basic human rights. They couldn't decide for themselves where to go, when to go, things like that. But They participated in community activities. They went to church. The living conditions seemed adequate, they're okay. So why do you think things kind of, I hate to use that word good, but why were they better then than they turned out to be later? Was it people? Was it the times? I mean, why was it that things started out to be at least livable, especially compared to what happened later?
Right. I think they were considered the quote-unquote good years, and what we're talking about is from about 1974 when the men were taken from Texas, and this group of men was farmed out to Texas. Other men went to Illinois, this group went to Iowa, other groups went to Illinois and South Carolina and other places. And so for these men, first of all, it's good because they're not in an institution anymore, okay? Very big, okay? They spent their formative years, ever since they were boys. They dropped off when they're like 10 or 11 years old at a state institution, and some of you may know, you don't want to live in an institution, okay? And so now they're taken out, they're taught to work with turkeys, and now suddenly they're living in a bunkhouse, which was a converted old schoolhouse in this small town of Atalissa. And for them, that's pretty damn good compared to where they had been. So there's the glow of that. Then the bunkhouse is in fairly good shape. By the way, a schoolhouse is not meant to be inhabited.
Right.
Right. So they've tricked it out into a dormitory. So all sorts of problems with that. But it's not horrendous, I suppose, from what I understand.
Compared to a state institution, perhaps, that's
Right.
underfunded
Right.
and badly staffed.
Compared to the college dorm I was in at St. Bonaventure. Not true. And so then what happens is, the human condition. The building is falling into disrepair, okay? The men are getting older, so they have more physical problems. Their job is so demanding physically. Their hands are becoming curved from doing the same repetitive work for weeks, for years and years and years. And T.H. Johnson is drinking, and he is not. His eye is not on the ball, and it kind of is a confluence of things, and the quote-unquote good times go away.
So one of the things that I wasn't aware, I was vaguely aware of, but this book really made clear to me, was that there's a section of the law that covers minimum wages called the Fair Labor Standards Act, passed in 1938. And at the beginning, it has a section in it that allows payment to workers who have a disability at a fraction of the wage to be determined, I think, by the employer with regulation, so that if you are doing half the work that someone who would be able-bodied is able to do, you could get half the minimum wage. And this just, it had never struck me before. And so these men are getting paid, but they're not getting paid the full wage. But they were doing the work.
Right.
They were doing the full work of the other people who were on the line with them, right?
That's
Can you
right.
tell us a little bit about that?
Sure. As you just said, so there's a law that says Nick is non-disabled, he does a task, he moves books, he does so many in an hour, okay? Dan, who has intellectual disability, does a smaller percentage of what Nick does. He does maybe 70. So that means that Nick would get $1 an hour, Dan would get 70 cents an hour under this law. And so it was, you can understand the philosophy behind the law. As we said the other day, I think that it may be related to providing employment for veterans of World War I who had incurred injury. I'm not positive, but I think that's the part of the root of it. But it is ripe for exploitation, and that's what happened here. The employer is supposed to really do the calculus. Is Dan doing this? Hey, by the way, maybe Dan is now doing 75. So now he deserves 75 cents, right?
Yep.
Maybe Nick's doing 50 now. No. So so the exploitation is, well, we're not really going to keep track of it, are we? Are we really going to have a chart? And they made up charts too.
Yep.
Willie Levi, okay, and they just made up numbers. They just made up numbers so that they would always wind up getting $65 a month. And so that's the problem with that. And as you allude to, the truth of the matter is that these guys were so proficient at what they did. They were so good at this lousy job that they had, these lousy jobs that they had, which raises the question of imagine all the other things that could have been done if the opportunity or the challenge had been presented to them. Instead, they're relegated to this lousy job that no one else wants to do. When they left, finally, when they were rescued years later, they were training non-disabled men and women to do what they were doing. They were that good.
Yeah, and that reminded me of, every exploited group always seems to be in that position. Women are training the men who are then going to take the jobs from them, for time immemorial.
That's right.
It just hit me between the eyes that here it is again, happening like that.
Right.
You started to talk about this a little bit, but in the early 1990s, things started to spiral downward. You mentioned T.H. Johnson's alcoholism. I think the plant got sold as well. Louis Rich no longer owned the plant, but I don't know if that made any difference. But there was a whole bunch of changes that seemed to happen right around then. Is that?
Also, so they just imagine this. I mean, it's really hard to imagine. There's an old schoolhouse. It's about 2 stories. The third floor has been burned out. The windows have now boarded up. The ceilings are leaking. And there are at times 60 men living here, all with intellectual disability. 60. And the number would fluctuate. By the time the garbage can was tipped over, there happened to have been 32 roughly who were living there at the time. So you can't find, who's trained to take care of 40 or 50 men with intellectual disability, all living together. I don't know if any of you have worked or been in a group home. If there are 4 or 5 people with disability, there's attention needs to be paid. Imagine 60 men, okay? And so they were hiring people who had no experience, not only with special needs or special education, no experience. And it was a high burnout job. And so, do you want to go and work at the bunkhouse? Oh no, I'm done. I'm going back to the turkey plant. No, I'm done doing that. I love those guys, but I can't do that job. And so the pool of possible employees to watch over these men got smaller and smaller until you got people who were, I don't want to say evil, but wholly ill-equipped, without the heart to even carry them through certain nights.
They were it was kind of like what I kept thinking about was the men were becoming like the turkeys. Mm-hmm. That nobody wanted to process the turkeys, and no one wants to deal with these men either. Mm-hmm. And so you're going to get the same kind of people in the bunkhouse, watching, supposedly taking care of them, as won't work in the turkey plant.
That's right.
I mean, to me, that put a pit in my stomach. It was just a horrendous realization when I was reading the book.
Right. And Nick has said this a few times, and I'm glad he has, because I thought of this all through the process. When I'm telling you this story, it sounds like something from the 19th century. It sounds Dickensian, it sounds Steinbeckian, all those kinds of things. It doesn't sound like real time. Everyone in this room except that baby who was crying. And I want that baby out of here. As one presidential candidate said. No, I'm kidding. No, get the baby out of here. Everyone here,
I love kids,
was alive when this was going on. I mean, this is not historic. This is real time. You know what I mean? So anyway, during those bad times, the way I think about it is that all around the country, their cohorts, others with intellectual disability, are enjoying the fruits of various legislative actions, including the Americans with Disability Act, which has been revised and improved over the years. Yet these guys are like hermetically sealed. I mean, like they're living in amber, the way I think about it, in this bunkhouse. And it's not, let me just tell you, this bunkhouse is not like hidden in the woods. It is the largest building in this town. As you go along Route 6, which begins in Provincetown and ends in California, I've been on it many times across the country. Route 6 goes right past that bunkhouse. So I think about these poor guys. Everyone else is enjoying the rights that they deserved, finally, perhaps belatedly granted to them, except for these guys. Okay, they can't have girlfriends. They can't say, "Hey, you know, I don't want to work with Turkey. I want to go work at the Johnny's Supermarket in West Liberty." No, you can't do that. I want to go to church. Well, we'll see. You know, I want to live somewhere else.
I don't want to do this anymore.
Yeah, I don't want to do this anymore. No, that ain't going to happen. So when one guy said, "I don't want to do this," he would get punished. Okay, well, no TV for you tonight. You can't watch your TV. So imagine telling a 40-year-old man, "Hey, you can't watch TV tonight. You're being punished." And so, you know, the book has some anecdotes of how that went horribly bad. So
that was the 90s, things are going bad. But even in the late 70s, a social worker, Ed George, blew the whistle on this situation. You have a whole chapter of him furiously typing away on his Selectric typewriter and writing up this stuff. And he's just got, you know, the wrath of God in him. He's going to hand this over, and then nothing happens. And then the same thing in 1979. The Des Moines Register's writing stories with headlines like "Retarded Texans Labor in Iowa Turkey Plant." And yet the cycle of work, back to the bunkhouse, work, back to the bunkhouse, maybe your $5 here and that, it just doesn't stop. What? How did that happen? I mean, you said that had the idea of everybody just driving by on Route 6. Is that really kind of what we're all just doing that? We're all just driving by?
you know, so the model, when I talked about the gray area here and how you know, it's easy to dismiss T.H. Johnson as the black hat. You know, I think he was trying to do the right thing, and I think other people thought, hey, this is the right thing. We're taking these boys, and we're gonna help them learn a trade, and they're gonna live in fraternity, and we'll take them to the amusement park once in a while. Ed George was a social worker in Muscatine, Iowa, which was that area, and his almost a very dear friend, his first cousin, had intellectual disability, so he was very much aware of that connection between the non-disabled and people with disability. He heard what was going on in Adalissa, like within a couple of weeks. They moved in the summer of 1974. He went there. He could not believe what he had seen, even in the good years. Mm-hmm. Okay, so this is when the bunkhouse is spanking new. This guy walks in, you know, the eyes of us, walks in and says, "This is wrong," and he writes this flaming memo to his superior, and he becomes a prophet, really, because he's saying this is abominable, this is slavery, this is anathema to everything we stand for. Mm-hmm. It's against community. These guys are being denied basic rights. So he calls out basically what I lay out in this book, albeit almost 40 years later, mm-hmm. and he sends it to a superior, and it disappears. And over the course of time, as you point out, the Des Moines Register did an investigation, the Department of Labor would stop in, someone would drop a dime, and then there'd be another investigation. And the people in Adalissa would assume that the government is taking care of it. So that absolved them of responsibility. Oh, the government, it must be okay. The government's taking care of it. But what happened was this operation was so unusual that it didn't fit in to the group home description. So the regs don't allow the state to go in to monitor it as a group home. And it's not really a sheltered workshop, so that doesn't give them the right to go in there. So the state officials throughout the years were always looking for reasons not to do the right thing. You know what I mean? In retrospect, that's what happened.
So they fell between the cracks of one department versus another, and between, well, somebody's doing this and I don't need to be responsible for it.
Right.
That's what started to really eat away at my conscience. Mm-hmm. You know, how much of that am I doing on a daily basis? And especially when I learned that the Lewis Rich plant, or now what is it called? It's called
I think it's
the Iowa Turkey Processing,
right,
or whatever, is the leading producer of turkey products for Subway. And if you go to Subway, all the meat there is turkey meat. It's not beef or pork. And yet, last time I went to Subway, I couldn't. was like, I know what this is now.
I
I knew before, but now I really know what it is.
because I do a lot of traveling, I spend a lot of time in the car singing to myself. No, I can't do McDonald's, I can't do Burger King, I'll go to Subway, it's healthier. I went there so many times over the years that now the smell of that bread makes me ill. I can't go in there anymore. It's got nothing to do with Jared, that's a whole other thing.
But in February 2009, this ended. Would you mind, I mean, it's in the book, but could you tell the
Do
story?
you want me to give it away?
Yeah. Yeah, well, they're here.
So this has been going on for decades. The men are now in their 50s and 60s and 70s, okay? The building is in squalor. There are so many cockroaches that you can hear them within the walls. This isn't hyperbole. Water is dripping from the ceiling into the dining room and into some of the men's bedrooms. The men, in some cases, have not seen any doctor. They have not seen a dentist. There had been a routine. To T.H. Johnson's credit, when he was doing well, they would always go. By the way, these guys did not have disability or Medicare because Johnson wanted no government. He was a libertarian of the first order, did not believe in government. And so he did some things where he would not apply locally for all the benefits that
Which they could have
all
gotten.
the services that they could have had in Muscatine County, where they were never afforded because Muscatine County didn't know they were there. Johnson is dead now. Kenneth Henry's not feeling well. The men are older. They decide to shut it down, okay? And so they take a few of the men and they sent them to lousy nursing homes in Texas. And that, as an aside, that's particularly painful because the men had money deducted from their salaries for years to be used to create kind of a retirement home bunkhouse in Texas. Remember, these guys are Texans, they're not Iowans, they're not home. And so the plan was, don't worry, Levi, we're gonna build a bunkhouse back in Texas and you're gonna sit on the back porch, you're gonna fish whenever you want, it's gonna be okay. And they took money out of their salaries to pay for this. And T.H. Johnson and Kenneth Henry got about a third of the way through, and Johnson got sick and died, and Kenneth Henry didn't have the heart for it anymore. So that project was never completed. So now what are we going to do with these guys? So they started dumping them in nursing homes. Many families, many of the men had no family whatsoever involved in their lives. Some of them did, a few of them did. And a sister was called to say that Keith is now going to be going down to a nursing home in Texas. We're going to shut down this operation. And she said, well, geez, Keith has been working there for 30-odd years. How much does he have in the bank? And the answer was $86. And so she went ballistic, and she called all sorts of Iowa officials, and she called the Des Moines Register, a prominent investigative journalist. And so the garbage can was tipped over at that point. A bunch of investigators walk in, they cannot believe what they're seeing, and here are all these men. And the men are, you take 20, now there's 21 men living there. It's like taking 21 people here. We're not all the same. Some of us are, paintings in the neck, and some of us are fun, and some of us are quiet. So is the case with 21 men. It's not a block of people, a block of intellectual disability. But a lot of them are quite social, and they were coming up to the investigators and holding out hands and saying, hi, I'm Willie Levi. And the hands are like constricted. So they were horrified, and there was an emergency decision to say, okay, all right, men, or boys, we're going on vacation. We're going on vacation, and they took them all out of there and brought them to a Motel 6. That's how we all spend our vacations, right? Motel 6. So they took over a Motel 6 and they lived there for a few days, and then they came up with a plan for many of them. Many of them wound up in a city about 2 hours northeast of Atlas and Waterloo. So that's what happened.
So they've been, I keep thinking of the word rescued, but I'm not sure that's even an adequate word.
I know.
They've been liberated.
I know,
There's
absolutely.
a better word.
Liberate's a better word.
And that's when someone you already mentioned comes into the story, which is, I think there are a lot of heroes in this story, but the one that struck me was a man named Robert Canino. Is that how you say his last name?
Yes.
Canino. Can you tell about how he got involved in this and how he ended up being the lawyer who got the compensation award that you mentioned at the
Right.
a little while ago?
He works for the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. He's a Texan, and he's a devout Christian, and so he sees himself as being as doing God's work. That's what he does. So he had been a lawyer at a white shoe firm, and he didn't like it. He wanted to be a white hat. He wanted to be a white hat. So and he had handled a case of human slavery. Okay, so he had a specialty of human slavery, and this case came across his desk, and he recognized it as another form of human slavery. And so he got involved, interviewed all the men, got to know them very intimately, and then had to figure out how to make a case, because there's a question of putting a man with intellectual disability on the stand. How would that go? Okay, he had to figure all that stuff out, and then he had to prepare for the case. And as we were talking yesterday, his house became an extension of his law firm. He took over the dining room table with records. His son and his daughter were helping him tab documents, because he had to know the ins and outs of that Federal Labor Standard Act. He had to know everything about their work schedule. He had to know about intellectual disability. There's a lot of stuff he had to do. And as it says in the book, he was so immersed in it that one night his family noticed that he had bruises on his forehead. And so now they're worrying. They're thinking that he has a hematoma up here. What's going on? And they figured out that it's because he spent so much time going like this as he was looking at documents, which just gives you a sense of the focus. And now it becomes trial time, and it's in Davenport at the federal court. And so he got there 3 weeks before the court trial and took over a hotel room and turned it into his law office, and filled the drawers where you keep your clothing with like fast food, like cans of tuna fish and ramen noodles and everything, because he was hunkering down.
Yep.
And then the trial begins, and he almost passes out. And the reason is he's dehydrated, because he's been drinking so much Diet Dr. Pepper.
Yep, by the
And
case.
because he's so nervous. And then he just does a brilliant job. What's interesting is that even after he won the case, he didn't let go of the case or the men. He remains very much in touch with them. This is now several years later after the lawsuit. And as you're saying, the verdict was, so Iowa hears this case, just as I'm telling it to you now. A jury of 12 people, all from Iowa. They're flabbergasted. They're also mortified in a way, because Iowa had a reputation for being kind of progressive in the care and the embrace of people with intellectual disability. Tom Harkin is from there, and so on. So this was like unbelievable. So they declare a $240 million judgment, and you know that that's not going to withstand the federal caps on jury awards. But it was a way of Iowa saying, we feel for these men. We are as outraged as anybody else. So then the award is reduced to a couple of million, and the Henry's Turkey Service owners begin to play a shell game with the money, okay? So even after they've lost this lawsuit, and these men have been denied all sorts of pay over the years, plus maybe some compensation for their pain and suffering over the years. Actually, the term was the loss of enjoyment of life, which is really hope. Anyway.
And how can you put a price on it?
Yeah, you can't. So anyway, they play a shell game with the money for several years, but Canino is the one who's watching it. Okay, it should be some other aspect of the Federal Department of Justice, but Canino personally takes it over, and then he notices something where they did something where they thought no one was looking. He alerted the federal judge. The federal judge saw the documentation and said, aha, we have you. And they collected about, maybe $1 million. And so the men now there were 32 men in the lawsuit, 4 died. So think about those 4 men who never really got to enjoy liberty. They die before there's any kind of compensation. But the money they're receiving is only about $25,000 or $30,000 a man, if they get that. But there's some happy stuff.
Right. And
This is what I'm worried about. Everyone's going to say,
No,
"Oh my God,
but
that's too sad."
That actually is what I want to go to
I'm going to grab
next.
the baseball book. I can't take it.
And I want to, we've been talking for a little over half an hour. I want to open things up to have all of you participate in the conversation. But that was one of my last questions, was to ask, well, so this isn't just the end of the story.
No.
How many of the men are still living? Many have passed
28.
away, but 28. And how are they doing? Are they living, how are they living? What are their lives like?
Well,
Because to me, that seems like at the end, one of the happier.
the truth of the matter here, the truth of the matter is they're doing quite well. Okay, so they're living next to you. Okay, they're in that house down the street. They now have choice. If they want to work, they work. If they don't want to work, they don't work. If they want a girlfriend and they can find a woman who would want to be their girlfriend, they make that connection. They sing at their choir. They go fishing. They do whatever they want now. They have choice. They go to the supermarket. Some of the men live with one another. Some of them didn't. Levi may not necessarily have liked Henry Wilkins. I don't want to live with that guy. I mean, just like the rest of us, right? But the men chose who they would live with, and they live in residences in Waterloo, most of them. A couple of the men live independently. Okay, so Gene Berg lives in a house by himself with minimal support. I think a social worker stops in maybe once or twice a week to make sure he's not drinking too much Dr. Pepper, really. But other than that, he's living independently, and so is Frank Rodriguez. He's living with his girlfriend in Des Moines. And so it's wonderful, but also it just kind of highlights what they had been denied for so long. And who knows what would have happened if they had been offered the opportunities in other employment and other skills and other life choices.
The what might have been.
Right. But, they're happy, they're resilient. I mean, there's a beauty to their resilience. I mean, we talk about heroes like Robert Canino and the social workers. The heroes to me are the men, because they just, as you said at the beginning, which was beautiful, it's one day at a time. We're going to,
I got that from you.
Well, it's beautiful that you quoted me. So,
Credit where credit's due.
Actually, it was a TV show in the 70s.
That's right.
Anyway.
Well, one question that somebody out there might have, but I'm going to take advantage of my position to ask it, and it's been eating at me ever since I read the book, is, we live in poultry country of Minnesota. We have some of the biggest chicken and turkey processing, raising and processing. Are there boys in the bunkhouse in our midst? Should we be looking for them? Should we be searching to that house down the street that we haven't gone to? Should we knock on the door?
It says the boys in the bunkhouse, servitude and salvation in the heartland. I was going to have the boys in the bunkhouse, Minnesota's fault.
Well, that makes me feel better.
No,
Feel a lot better.
in the book it's described that after I wrote about this for the New York Times, some social workers were saying, this isn't the only case, this isn't an aberration, this isn't a one-off, this is happening. And they gave me a lead to another case, a brother of one of the men in this book, and it was in South Carolina, and I wound up going there, and it was the same damn thing. And that was in 2014, so that's less than 2 years from now, right?
Right.
So less than 2 years ago, I found a similar situation in Newberry, South Carolina, and a month or so ago, a friend sent me a news clipping from somewhere else in the Midwest, it might have been Nebraska, where employees were working along an assembly line in a meat processing plant, just like these men were, and they were being denied bathroom access because you had to hit your numbers. You had to hit 20,000 turkeys a day or 20,000 chickens a day. And so the men who were working along the assembly line were just relieving themselves there. And in terms of Minnesota, who is doing these jobs?
The
Immigrants.
Right, so no one, it's not like middle-class white people, right? No. And so it's Hispanics, it's Somalians, and it's, in this case, it's people with intellectual disability, because no one else wants to do it. So,
Well, I've been hogging the floor. Who would like to join me in conversation? Please.
I'll be a part of it too.
Yeah, you too.
I'll qualify, I've read half of the book, but I was wondering what the difference was in 2009, and do we know who made that phone call to the social worker? Because it was like a middle of the night call on her cell phone, correct?
Right, so remember I mentioned the sister of a man who learned that her brother had only $86 in savings.
Okay.
So one of the calls she was making went to the Department of Human Services, and a dispatcher forwarded it to that social worker who was on duty that night.
I get it.
So it was essentially that sister who started that.
And so do you credit that social worker for really getting the law enforcement involved, and really turning the...
Oh yeah, she's and among the roster of heroes, absolutely, because she took it very personally. You know, you can become hardened as a reporter or as a social worker or as a teacher. The trick is to remain open, to have your heart always open. You know, not to become inured to certain things. And I think these social workers who got involved at this moment were not hardened by their many years of social work service, and they were there and they stepped up. Good question. Yeah,
John.
I think, two questions, one really short. I think you wrote the book where it's easy to identify the heroes, but you were nuanced, which is really effective writing enough to make it harder to define the villains, because they weren't consistently villainous.
right.
So I have two questions. How do you describe, because I was never sure at the end, though it was sort of cathartic for the town, the culpability of Atalissa, Iowa,
Yeah,
and the people of Atalissa, which is a tiny, tiny place.
right.
And whatever happened to Randy and Drew Neubauer? Because really, they were pretty villainous, it seemed, in the end. They seemed like among the clearer villains in the story, and there was no closure of that loop in the end.
Right.
And just Randy and Drew were the last, I hate to use the word, caretakers.
Right.
Boss people is what they sometimes call them, of the bunkhouse,
Right.
for those who haven't got to that part of the book.
I should say that no one was ever criminally charged. Okay, nobody. Okay, and this is a matter of great debate in Iowa, because clearly there seem to have been points of entry for a criminal inquiry. And Randy and Drew Neubauer were the last house managers of the place. And, you know, even in that case, I tried to meet them where they were. I think it's easy to just say, here are your bad people, you know. It's not entirely Randy's fault nor Drew's. I mean, they're the last in a long line of being assigned or receiving the situation. So, you know, I think both of them were profoundly flawed and profoundly ill-equipped for this job for which they were making $10 an hour, being in charge of 32 men. I mean, it's crazy. So, and what was the first? So you know, Atalissa, after the story broke in Iowa, all of the Iowa media descended upon this small town. It has 12 streets. Okay, it has 2 churches, 2 bars, and a post office, and a granary. That's it. And so then all of Iowa descends upon it. And what happens is we all want to find who is culpable.
Who did this?
How could you? How could you not see? I think that the town's response was, one, the men never complained. Okay, and this puzzled me for a long time. The men never complained, but we know now why they never complained, because they never knew anything better. They had nothing to compare. They had nothing to compare it with. They had, you know, a difficult childhood. Then they're in institutions. Hey, they're getting, you know, and they may be afraid of sounding the alarm and winding up somewhere worse. So there's that. I've always thought, John, of Atalissa as being Iowa, Minnesota, New York, where I'm from, as being America. You know, like, I think that we could go into town, we can go to St. Cloud, and we might find, you know, a place where several people with intellectual disability are living, and they're, for whatever reason, they're invisible to us. You know what I mean? Atalissa, Atalissa at times would embrace these men, and there were women who really took care of them and loved them. I mean, and knew them by name. So it wasn't like a collective, oh, that's one of the boys. They knew Henry and Levi. And it's complicated. It's complicated, right? It's us. Atalissa is us. That's how I look at it. So
That's why I actually thought the book was
Yeah.
very finely done, because it didn't simply create clear divisions
Right.
one way or the other. You did
Right.
have to reflect on all of that, and ultimately reflect on yourself, so thank
Right.
you.
Yeah, thank you. Hi.
Didn't this, or what was the reaction of the state of Iowa? I mean, those in the governor or whoever else, when this came out in this trial, because is it the state that should be doing inspections of these plants? Who does, the inspections of wherever food is produced? Were there no inspectors that ever went into this plant or these plants?
Right. So first of all, it would be mostly federal oversight, OSHA, okay, to make sure, right? And so the conditions in the plant itself were not poor, okay?
Even though some men were relieving themselves in advance?
You got a problem with that? Why, just
Where does it
because
say
they're
in
working with food?
Where does it say in the law that you can't, that you're,
When that happened, one of the men was actually knocked down, and the company, he was knocked down by Randy because he wasn't working fast enough. Okay, that's a whole nother thing. If you didn't work fast enough, you weren't allowed to watch TV or go to the mini mart. But when the company found out that Randy had done that, he was banned from the plant. So that's a separate issue about how the plant was being operated. I'm sure, like any large-scale food operation, they had been violated over the years, but I think that they were generally considered, a good employer, I think. Okay, so.
but to piggyback on Maureen's question, wasn't there a housing inspector or something for the city of Atalissa that would look at apartments or enforce the building code or something? I mean, I don't
The
know.
building
That's what
right.
I kept thinking, does a
Yeah.
town like that even have? I mean, they would
It
have a
seemed-
building code,
Yeah.
but
I don't know, Atalissa was, yeah. This is a town where they had one gun, and
Yeah.
it was from like 1914.
you tell the story.
And it was kept in a
beautifully.
drawer, and it hadn't been used in 50 years, and it was rusted. So, the fact that they would have rigorous building code regs is, I think, is probably not possible. And it was a town building. It was, Henry's Turkey Service was paying rent to the town. I think that, as you said, it fell between the cracks. And so the regulators you think would be on top of it were looking for reasons to say, that isn't my job. And the men suffered as a result.
You talked earlier about that it was really important for you to talk to these men and actually we had before. What were their reflections on their time when they were actually in the bunkhouse and when they were working? What do they say about their time and where they're at emotionally then and how they're reflecting on it now?
Right. First of all, they were very fond of T.H. Johnson because he was their father figure. A lot of these guys had no fathers, or their fathers had abandoned them or were no longer in their lives or what have you. And T.H. Johnson used to have a billfold in his pocket and it was filled with cash, and he would say, hey Levi, here's $5, go get me a can of sardines, keep the change. They loved that. Hey Levi, it's your birthday, here's $20, don't tell the other guys. And he would do that with each of the guys. And he would play with them and he knew them, and so they enjoyed that. What else did you ask?
Just
What were their reflections?
Yeah.
The challenge for me, and I think certainly for Canino, was, you know, the men have intellectual disability, okay? But what I think Kanina would tell you, and what I certainly found, was the only hitch for me was in the time continuum, okay? If I said to Levi, so Levi, how long have you been living in the bunkhouse? He might say, oh, it's been about 2 years. Or it's about, I've been here for about 6 months, or whatever, when in fact it had been 30 years. So keeping a fixed sense of time was a struggle for me. Not necessarily for the men, but for me in trying to pinpoint things. But the men were they could be very, again, many personalities, but some of the men were quite expansive, and their stories always matched up. There was a lot of triangulation. And they would speak highly of T.H. Johnson, they would speak highly of certain supervisors they had had over the years, and they would say, oh, and she was very nice. She died of cancer. You know, the death was a thing. They knew that that person was no longer there to save them, and they would say it like that. She died of cancer, you know, matter of fact, but, you know, you could tell it was a painful thing. They were very good on specifics, and they were specific about the physical abuse. And what really galled them, was this charge by the supervisors that they did not work hard enough, okay? Because they thought they were giving their heart and soul to the job. You know, once in a while you'd have a guy slack off or say, I don't want to go to work today, TH, or whatever. But they really, really worked hard for the Henry Sturkey service, and they hated hearing Randy say, you know, you're not allowed out of the van today to go get a Mountain Dew because you didn't work hard enough. So, yeah.
How long did you work on this book, and what was the trajectory of your emotions while you were working on it?
I have no emotions. I'm a
Long and proud.
repertorial automaton. You know, I saw that little article in March of 2013. I thought I would do a quick column, quick being maybe spend a week there and get to know her. And I wound up spending the rest of 2013 almost entirely on that. And then the story appeared in March of 2014, and I felt that there was way more that could be told about this story, many more nuances. So I got a book contract somehow through some, you know, I don't know, mistake by the publisher, and then worked on it for another year or so. And so since 2013.
But like Noreen alluded to, did it take a toll on you? It took a toll on me reading it.
Didn't you know?
I mean,
So this-
really?
So this is the third time I tried to sidestep that, right?
Yeah, and I'm not going to let you. You tried yesterday, too.
You know, I've covered so many things over the years, so many tragedies like 9/11 where friends of mine died. And what happens is in the moment, you set aside your emotions, your old business. You're not an automaton. I'm being facetious there. You're empathetic, but whatever it's doing to you, you think to yourself, I'll deal with this later. Okay? I'm sure that people in law enforcement, I'm sure doctors and nurses and all sorts of social workers, you know, teachers, say, I'll deal with this later. And that's what I would do. You know, you would focus with Levi, and he would tell you a story about getting kicked in the ass and being called a nigger and all that kind of stuff. And then you stay focused, and you would listen, and you would empathize genuinely, not as some kind of conceit. And then later on, you know, you'd sit and it would come back to you, as it did with 9/11 and with Katrina and some other things. So that's how, you know, it's just a natural processing. It's a form of almost grief, and then, you know, coming back, yeah. So, yeah.
You might have been asked this while you were here, Dan. In terms of local tragedies, we're
I know,
mourning the loss of,
it's unbelievable.
yeah. So I'm sure you followed the story. Any impressions from the outside looking in?
Seeing that story made me cry. I told Nick that I was listening to Minnesota Public Radio, and they were recounting the court case and what had been said in court in front of the parents, and I couldn't take it. Yeah, I told Nick too that I didn't want to write about it. I don't think I could do it. Hey, thanks for asking that.
Well, I'll join you.
We just wanted to make sure you
Yeah.
had motions.
There you go. I mean, I was thinking that too, because I dropped my 2 children off, my wife and I, in college on Sunday. So we're empty for
Yeah.
the first time in 20 odd years. And then when I read this and listened to the court, what was said in court, thank God my office door was closed, because
Yeah.
I just wept. I just could not,
Yeah.
you know, when you think about, and then, you know, thinking about talking to you today, there but the grace of God goes I, is a theme that's been running through so much of my life the last week, and I bet of a lot of people's as they read this book, as they've heard this.
I would say that I am blown away by the grace of the parents. So. All right, ask a funny question. Come on, let's go. Come on. Ask me about baseball. Come on.
Have you been back to Pawtucket lately?
I have actually. I'm looking into some. I've made a habit of this lately, of visiting retired mobsters, and you know. And
Do tell.
Yeah, it's just a hobby of mine. But I was with a guy the other day, and he's 80 years old, and he had been shot 7 times by Whitey Bulger, and he says, yeah, shot 8 times and stabbed in the heart. Go ahead, punch me in the chest. I'm not going to do that.
Did you? You didn't.
No, I
No, you
didn't. But yeah, so he said, "Geez, if I could, I'd be robbing a bank right now." That's what he said. Yeah,
So there's your next book.
yeah. Well, maybe I don't know.
We could ask you about the twins a bit.
No.
Oh, yeah, bottom of the 33rd, all right. My gosh, that's.
Tell you what, for a laugh, Dan, why don't you tell them about your first interview with the New York Times?
All right. We'll close out on this. Are we
Sure,
almost at
that
the end?
sounds good. It's up to Nick.
Are we near the end?
We are getting there, yes.
Well, I can also tell you, who's been to Baraboo, Wisconsin?
I have.
All right.
Ringling
I
Brothers.
went there for a reunion of retired burlesque queens, and I was very fortunate to be there. But I learned how to do a proper burlesque move. So let's see, you put an apple here, an orange here. You look scared.
Yeah, we're moving away.
An apple here, an orange here, and a coffee bean here. And this woman who was 78, and she used to go by the name of Bambi. Don't take this. And she said, where should I put my hands? You hit the apple, you hit the orange, and you grind the coffee. That's for you. So, all right, so the New York Times. Yeah, it's
I can just see the editor of the New York
formally,
Times asking
after
you to
this
do
will be
that.
formally of the New York Times. Getting hired at the New York Times or applying for a job. The first time was after college. I had graduated from St. Bonaventure University, and I applied for a job at the New York Times as a clerk. And the clerk's job paid more than what my father was making. Okay, neither of my parents went to college. My mother didn't finish high school. She was a farm girl from Ireland. My father finished high school and night school. And the idea of getting a job at the New York Times was, crazy. We were a daily news family. So anyway, I applied for the job, and the woman said, "Come on in." And so, okay, that's good, except I didn't have any clothing for a job interview. I was digging ditches at the time. And so I had to borrow my father's blazer, blue blazer. I had to borrow his belt. I had to borrow his dress shoes. and his tie. So I'm like swimming in my father's clothing, right? Going to an interview at the New York Times, and I lived on Long Island. And so I took the train into Penn Station, and all the while I'm thinking of the big words I'm going to use in the interview to impress the New York Times. And I told Nick that the word I was, I don't know why, it was, the word I was planning to use was Hyperborean. Okay. Does anyone know, like, that just trips over the tongue so lightly, right? So Hyperborean means what? It means like extremely cold, like, you know, really, really cold. I don't know if you people understand that
We
feeling.
need to know this word.
But I went to St. Bonaventure, it was just below Buffalo, you know, it gets the lake effect. And so, you know, if she asks, well, oh, I see you went to St. Bonaventure, I was going to work in, well, it's rather Hyperborean up there. So I'm thinking about these words, you know, and I get out of Penn Station, swimming in my father's clothing, and I'm walking up 8th Avenue. The New York Times building at that time was on 43rd Street, so it's only about an 8 to 9 block walk. And so as I'm walking up 8th Avenue, thinking of big words, and it's 9:30 in the morning is the appointment, right? A guy comes walking toward me, and he has a paper bag, okay? And he's walking like this. He's walking towards me like this. And I see him, and I begin trying to get out of his way. So like I say, it's like that Charlie Chaplin film where they're on the ship, you know. I go this way, he goes that way. I couldn't get out of the way of him. And then he spun around, and he hit me across the chest with his bottle of what?
Whiskey.
Colt 45 malt liquor. Colt 45 malt liquor all over my father's suit, tie, shirt, and it's 15 minutes to my interview at the New York Times. And so I had a meltdown, and I tried shaking malt liquor off my coat, and so then I went into the interview, and it's like a blank. It's as though it had never happened. I only remember one question from the woman, and that was, how many languages do you speak, right? English and Long Island. At that time it was called Buttafuoco, but you might not get that. So I know what she was thinking, like, because I'm reeking of beer. I have an Irish surname. She thinks I stopped off at McCann's to get some liquid courage. And then, okay, I just left. And then I'm out on the street smelling of beer, like I don't know what happened. And then usually when you go through that, you get like a letter, saying, thank you, please come in again, or, sorry, we filled the position. I never got anything. It was as though it had never, ever happened. And so for years after, I was afraid to go back into the building. And then I applied every once in a while. And one time, I could see why I never got hired. One letter was, Dear Mr. Boyd, I know that the New York Times...
Mr. Boyd?
Yeah, Dear Mr. Boyd, I know that the New York Times has a rich history of nepotism. My cousin works on the loading docks in Long Island City for the New York Times. Never responded and something like that. So anyway, that's the story about never getting hired. So I wound up getting hired through a clerical error years later. So anyway.
Could I ask what, this is to be a potential...
I'm not going to do it again.
No,
I mean, it's an apple here, an orange here, and a coffee bean here.
And the grind.
Yeah, that's
The
okay.
grind part.
But this is potentially of interest to the audience. I saw something, I don't know if it was on Frontline or where, about this. There's somewhere it was either a little short documentary somewhere.
About me getting hired at the Times?
It's about the bean.
Yes, about these men.
Yeah,
And I can't remember where.
I can tell you.
Oh, good. So people might want to see the visuals.
Sure. If you go to nytimes.com and you search my name and Bunkhouse, there's a long article that I wrote, but in addition to the long article, we did a 35-minute documentary where you meet Willie Levi and you meet Henry Wilkins, and it slows it down. So it's a documentary. So
Maureen,
those
you're
of you
not-
who don't want to read the book, who couldn't be bothered, is that what you're saying?
I know.
Oh, everybody, if you don't have to read the book,
Check my
just...
Facebook page,
Is
later.
it on your
It's on my Facebook
Oh,
page.
And we'll have that on a link.
Yeah.
On the webpage.
It was
Well,
on
I
the-
want to thank
Thank you.
Dan for a wonderful.
Thank you.
And our host,
Thank you.